welcome back to Fun Scale Modeling. This series is focusing on building the Fun Scale Park Flyer P40C Tomahawk. In this episode, we'll be starting construction on the wing. There are several steps that you need to complete before you can start construction of the wing. The first one is removing all of the wing parts from the sheet. Here I've done that. Here are some trailing edge parts and the rest are in here. I usually use some sort of container. This was a to-go container that just cleaned on out. You can use Tupperware or even a cardboard box. I do recommend that you do not remove the parts until you're ready to start using them. And the reason why. I had recently removed some parts and I seem to have misplaced a couple of them. These are the parts themselves. So what I did is I went to the parts sheet and made a copy of these and printed them out. And I'll show you on how you can hand cut some parts if you should need to do so. Hand cutting parts is not difficult, really. One of the things that you need to do is you need to transfer the part information onto your wood here. A couple of different ways to do that. I've seen where people have used photocopies of the plan sheets, placed it upside down and used an iron and used the heat of the iron to transfer the ink onto the wood. It does work. It does create an inverse of your numbering, so you just need to be aware of that. You can use glue, like Elmer's glue, and glue this onto it, but then again, you also have to remove the paper at some point in time. The other thing you can do is to tape it, and for a simple outline like this, you can certainly do that. What I like to use, though, is this spray adhesive. This is the same adhesive that I use to attach the tissue to the carrier sheets when printing my own patterns onto the tissue. So what I'll do first is sort of rough cut these to shape. So I don't necessarily want to cut on the line, I'm going to cut next to it. And I also give myself a bit of tab there, so it makes it easier for removal. Next is I have some wax paper here, and I'll spray these setting these aside. I'm going to go ahead and put them on my balsa wood. Hold them up to the light to make sure that I've got all of my part on the balsa wood. And you can overlap a little bit here, it doesn't matter because as long as the parts don't overlap. We'll give that a few moments to tack up and we'll come back and cut out the parts. With the glue having tacked up, we'll go ahead and now cut out the parts. So I'm going to do kind of separate the two pieces so they're a little bit easier to work with. If you've got a straight line and your wood is not very thick, you can certainly cut right on the line. I'm using a scalpel here and it's a pretty sharp blade, so it doesn't require a lot of additional cuts. If this were, say, a rounded curve, my recommendation would be to cut a little bit outside of the line and then use your sandpaper to block it down. Go ahead and I'll trim up this piece here. And from here, I'm going to cut off the long lengths. So again, because this is a straight line, it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to cut right on the line. And when cutting with the grain. Now, one tip to try as well is as you start to get into these smaller pieces, you get this sort of situation happening. So what I'll do is I'll put a piece of scrap of the same thickness behind it, and it helps to steady the ruler. Just taking my time, letting the blade to do the work. I just have this small piece here. And then we can very easily tease it and just peel it back as needed. I'm going to leave them on for now, just because it makes it much easier to identify later. We'll do this for the rest of the parts. The next step in preparation for building the wing is to work on the leading edge blanks. So there is a pattern that is on the plans, but you can also use the parts themselves if the plans don't include a pattern. The first thing that you want to do is get the correct size thickness. The leading edge is made from 1/4 inch balsa. Because it's critical and to help reduce warping at a later point in time, you want to look at how true the edge are of the pieces of wood that you're looking at. So looking down this, straight down this line and this line, I can see that one side is much more straight than the other one. One tends to bow a little bit like this. If you cut from that side, your wing is naturally going to do that as well. If by looking down both sides that you see that it's got a curve on each side, then you can use a very long straight edge and trim away a section to make sure it's straight as possible. The next thing that we need to do is to identify how tall or deep do we need to make our leading edge plank. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. Like I said, there's the pattern. The other one is to actually use the ribs themselves as markers. So here is one of the main ribs. This is one of the tallest ribs. I'm going to lay that flush against a straight edge and then put a piece of scrap next to it. Using that scrap, I'm going to mark the point where these two touch base. So that's it right there. I'm going to do the other side just to make sure. Now, what I'll do is I'll trim that up. And this is our leading edge height that we need. Then what you can do is you can take your balsa stripper and use this to determine the correct width that you need to cut. So I'll need a little bit further. Now I'm going to go it's very close. I'm going to go just a little bit big. Then with that, now we can go ahead and we can cut our leading edge using our balsa stripper. So now we have our height or depth set. We've identified the correct side to cut from. Now we'll go ahead and we'll strip out the blank. With thicker wood, it does take a little bit more pressure to get it to go through. Just slowly take your time and work it through. Now what I like to do is to mark which one is our actual blank, because these two will be pretty close if you're not knowing which is which. The overall wingspan of the airplane is around 27 inches. This is a 36-inch sheet. You don't need to use a sheet this size. You can use smaller ones, just as long as it's the same length or more than the outer panels. All right. So here we have our piece. Looking down at it's pretty true. And we'll go ahead now and look at cutting it to the correct lengths, as well as adjusting for the height of the tip. Okay, so we've got our blank cut here. We're looking at our template and we're looking at the plans themselves. I'm going to first cut this section here, so I'm going to go just a little bit oversized because we do have an additional scrap, and I'm also going to mark it along on this end. So using this is our marker. Go ahead and I'm going to cut it to shape. Set that aside for later. Now with this here, we need to take in consideration that this wing panel, by this down here, so I'm going to move it a little bit further so you can see it. Yeah, you can see down here, this is where the dihedral is. We need to account for that. So within the kit and within the design comes this item. This is an angle template that you're going to use to set the angle of this particular rib, which when you elevate it up is the correct angle. So we can use this to pre-trim the leading edge for what we need. So again, I'm going to check on my end just like that. And we'll draw a line there. Just along that line. I'm trying to keep the hacksaw as vertical as possible. Just a little bit of an angle. There. That will be just fine for what we need. You can also sand it like this. And then we can cross-check it with our template. It's pretty good. So when we do the tip template, we can also use the same technique that we did when we created the width or the height for the intersection. So what I'll be doing is using my ruler and then we'll rough mark. Now on this one here, I'm going to go a little bit above where the mark, the true point would be. So you can see there. And the reason being is this is of course a little bit longer, and so in essence we might be trimming it back too much. Go ahead and get our cutting board here. And we'll go ahead and we'll use a straight edge to cut from that point to that point. So while we're going to cut this, I wanted to show you another item that I think is useful, and that's this piece of flat aluminum bar stock. It's 1/16 by 3/4 inch wide, and it's about 4 inches or 4 feet long. At least it was until I trimmed it down for another project. But these work really well if you need longer rulers or something that doesn't necessarily need to have the ruling on it. So again, we're going to sort of hold this in place, mark that, and what would be easier would be to actually cut it from the other side. So cutting from the wide end, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transfer. Let's see here, I'm transferring the mark. So that's the side that we started with. That's the side that we have. And then again, lining this up. So we've got that mark. Now it's important that you put a fair amount of pressure so these don't slide around while you're cutting. And again, just letting the knife do the work. Trying to keep it as 90 degree to the cutting plane as possible. Drifting off of 90 a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and trim that. It's not as critical. This is really, it's a rough cut, if you will, for the leading edge blank. Later on, we're going to be shaping this, and this line won't matter as much. But what it does is allows you to have less to trim off at a later point in time. Just makes life a little easier. All right, so we've got our leading edge blank. We'll go ahead and we'll test. Looks like it fits pretty well right there. So we'll go ahead and do the exact same thing for the other side. So we've got all of our blanks cut. We've got our center section and our two outer sections. One thing you can do too is if you happen to see that maybe this needs to be cleaned up or angled slightly, you can use one of your existing sanding blocks, line this up, just go like that. That helps create a nice clean edge. So we've got our center section here and our outer panel blanks. For construction of the wing, you need to determine whether or not you want to include plug-in landing gear or not. If you don't, you can go ahead and skip this step. If you do, then there's a couple of parts you need to be aware of. The first is G1. So looking at the plans and the instructions here, it says that you need to glue G1, each one of these, to a 1/16 inch piece of sheet balsa wood here. So that's what I have. I'm going to go ahead and use some Zap Gap or some thicker CA. Go ahead and glue those in place. We'll give that a moment to dry and then we'll cut them free. Let's go ahead and cut the excess away. Just taking our time and slowly working through the wood. I chose a little bit harder wood for this lamination piece because there's going to be the stress of the landing gear on it. And if it's not precise, it's okay. We'll go ahead and use the sanding block to clean it up. Now, to get this section cut out, I'm going to use one of my pins, and I'm pushing it in each of the corners. And I'm also going to use it to kind of go along this edge here, just helping me mark where it's going to be and make it easier to cut out later. And then I'm going to very carefully just start cutting this section out. It's going to take some time, but that's okay. There we go. Now I'm going to use a smaller sanding file to get in there and clean up those corners. And I can even use my X-Acto here and there if I need to. A lot of this 1/16 sheet is going to be sanded away. We're using it just more or less as a sort of a filler for this part later on. We have here the brass tubing that's going to be going in there, so we use that as a guide, and we can see, yep, we got quite a bit more to go. Using this as a guide. This later on, once we constructed the wing and covered it, this is going to slide in there. So we want to make sure that there's plenty of room for this to get in there. It's just not big enough of an opening to do it that way. So. In, and it slides in pretty good. Alright, so we're going to now glue the G parts to the W3 assemblies. I'm going to use some wood glue for that, just because I want to give myself a little bit more time in getting the alignment right. I'm gluing the part that was laser cut to the inside for alignment purposes, because my one that I glued on the exterior might be just a little bit off, but if these two match up, which they should, I'll have a much better fit. Looks good. And I'll go ahead and now I'll add the other W3 to this side. We want to make sure that these two ribs are in alignment to each other as well. So setting them on the surface just to make sure. So before the wing construction, now is a good time also to cut the brass inserts that go into the wing. So on the addendum here, they give us a dimension to cut. So we'll go ahead and I'll mark that. I'll be using my Dremel and this cutting wheel. Make sure when you're using this cutting wheel, you're being careful, using safety, including safety goggles. So we've trimmed up our brass pieces, but as you can see, there's quite a bit of flash around the exterior. So I'm going to go ahead and just use a file to get this smooth again. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you do have to make sure that both the inside and the outside is removed from burrs. For the inside, you can go ahead and use one of these. It's a small file. I mentioned this, I believe, in one of the earlier episodes, but just get on the inside to clean it up. And then, of course, test to make sure that your other piece can telescope in there. So this end looks good, but this end still needs it. So here we go, just like what we need. We'll do the same thing to this piece. We've cleaned up the brass piece. We've got our W3 assembly. It still needs to be finalized. And then we're going to check to make sure if it fits in there, which it does. One additional thing to do before we start setting up the wing is to look at the stringers that we have. So these are stringers that I have cut using the balsa wood stripper, and they're pieces of wood from the sheets that were included with the laser cut kit. We want to check and make sure that ones that we have are not too pliable. So if we look at this one here, I'm not putting a lot of pressure, but you can see it doesn't bow that much. This one here, not too bad as well. And you can also rotate it to see if there's one way where it's more resilient than the other one. This one here, you can see I'm not putting much pressure, but it's bowing considerably much more. So this one I'm not going to use on the wing. I'm going to make sure that I have 4 of these for the bottom and 4 of them for the top that are of this sort of stiffness or harder.